A cultural explosion is one way to sum up the decade of the 1960s. Different styles of music, massive political protests, and changes in fashion are all factors of this historical time period. But what was the catalyst for these changes? A group of four young men from Liverpool, who called themselves the Beatles. The overwhelming response to the music of the Beatles revolutionized the way the world reacted to music. The departure from conformity was seen in the evolution of the individual through music, political activism, and fashion. In a time when Americans were in mourning over the assassination of their former president John F. Kennedy and dealing with various hardships, such as the Vietnam War, racial discrimination, and the Berlin Wall, everyone was desperate for some light news. Luckily, a British band had just exploded in the UK and was sent to test their talent in the States. On February 7, 1964, the somber eyes of Americans would be drawn to these oddly dressed men.
So they're looking for a group, especially moving into the end of the 60s, that really encapsulate these feelings of sort of an unsettled time.
When the Beatles touched down from Liverpool into New York City's JFK Airport, they had no idea of the mass hysteria that awaited them. Accurately summing up their arrival, Ringo was later heard saying, "So this is America. They all seem out of their minds." One of the reasons people were so crazy about the Beatles is because of their different style of music. The foundation of the Beatles' songs came from African American culture, and this influence can be heard throughout many of their works.
The African American imprint is, of course, very strong, but it's already a form of musical syncretism. It's already
The Beatles' music was, in some ways, black music with a British twist. Because of the positive responses the Fab Four received from blending these types of music into one, more artists started to do the same. Music was now becoming a melting pot of various cultures. The anticipation of the band's arrival in America, in conjunction with department stores' ability to offer more affordable clothing at this time, made for a wonderful time in the retail industry. Females of all ages loved the Beatles' style, causing men to expend more effort in deciding what they wore, thus beginning a menswear revolution. In hopes of being a little more like the Beatles, males started letting their hair grow longer and took a keen interest in wearing tight suits. Many parents found this style of clothing to be too tight to be appropriate and the hair to be too long to be acceptable.
You want to get a haircut at all?
No,
thanks.
I had one yesterday.
Beatle haircut you've got?
Yes.
How'd you work it out?
Well, I just let my hair flop around until it's all messy.
What do your parents say about it?
They don't like it.
You can still see these fitted suits in men's fashion today. Males, especially celebrities, continue to mimic the Beatles' shaggy haircut. Fans everywhere were seen sporting Beatles paraphernalia, and store owners couldn't have been more pleased. Never before had such merchandising power been inspired by one group of artists. In 1966, the band released their album Revolver. Music analysts find this work to be groundbreaking because of many qualities. One trait about Revolver critics adore is that it contains various electronic components such as tape loops, electronically altered voices, and pet sounds. The Beatles' use of the technology of the recording studio revolutionized music going forward. These techniques are still prevalent in music today. Another factor critics praise about Revolver is its political content and song lyrics. When discussing the protest movements of the 1960s, many experts attribute the Beatles' song lyrics as a strong inspirational factor. The song Taxman is a good example. In this song, the band protests high income tax rates. One line of the lyrics is, "If you get too cold, I'll tax the heat. If you take a walk, I'll tax your feet. Taxman." Later in the song, the band directs their lyrics to Mr. Wilson and Mr. Heath, referring to Harold Wilson, the British Labour Prime Minister at this time, and Edward Heath, the leader of the Conservative Party. After this song was released, Britons really became more mindful and displeased on the amount of taxes they were paying. The Beatles songs were now interfering with the government. Over the years, the band became increasingly involved in world politics. This involvement was amplified by their trip to India in early 1968. While they vacationed, the Beatles wrote another one of their social commentaries called Revolution. They used this song as their personal response to the Vietnam War. They sing, "When you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out?" This music showed the world the Beatles' positive view on peace and changed more citizens' approach to violence. This song further spiked interest on the war, and a greater number of people began protesting. By promoting peace and love through their music, the Beatles inspired their fans to protest for just that, peace and love. The thought-provoking song lyrics motivated their listeners to take a side on controversial issues and to voice an opinion. Because of the Beatles' music, the world atmosphere became more politically charged. As Paul McCartney put it, we were just the spokesman of a generation. The Beatles had accomplished the unthinkable. They had stretched from the realm of music into the realm of politics. In addition to expressing political opinions through their music, the Beatles made important statements with their new Indian-inspired attire. The Fab Four began wearing Nehru jackets, paisley suits, and grew beards and mustaches. This was a big departure from their earlier clean-cut wardrobe. Many parents were offended by this look, thinking it symbolized an anti-establishment attitude on the band's part, but the message these four men were really trying to convey was more anti-fashion, and a desire to dress in ways that expressed the individual's personality, rather than what society dictated was normal. Throughout their entire career, the Beatles influenced how their fans carried themselves. Changing the meaning of fashion was one factor of the revolution the Beatles stirred in America. Traits the Beatles contained can be seen in many artists and musical groups today.
What bands did the Beatles not influence? Anything that has followed in the wake of the Beatles, in some sense, has been influenced by the Beatles. It's simply because there's no one who's not living in a cave somewhere who wasn't exposed to their music. And then, of course, if we move beyond that time, I mean, anything, I don't know, whatever you want to say, Pink Floyd, The Police, Shakira, I mean, the Beatles are in there somewhere.
Nearly 45 years after the Beatles' career ended, people of all ages still listen to their music and are inspired by what they hear.
I'd have to say that it was the Beatles more than any other single group or artist that inspired my musical career, and here I am, a musician and music professor.
Whenever I teach popular music, I ask my students at the beginning of the course, if, sort of the desert island question, if you had one group, one artist's music you could take with you to the desert island, who would it be? And every time I've asked, the answer has been the Beatles. That's the highest percentage, and these are people are 18 to 22. It's the Beatles. It's still the Beatles.
In December of 1967, 60% of American college students claimed that the Beatles' album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and/or John Lennon was the single most important influence in their lives. This is one example of the massive impact the Beatles made on their fans. The Beatles' invasion led to a revolution on multiple fronts. In an attempt to imitate their idols, Beatles fans made huge fashion statements, shifting the cultural aspects of what their fans wore by making it a way to express themselves. Their thought-provoking songs made citizens more aware of what was going on with their government, thus making them more politically active. The Beatles' innovative sounds, such as the use of reverse tapes, pet sounds, and creative instruments, shifted the paradigm of rock and roll, yet still influences many artists today.
There's just something about the Beatles that's different. They are the defining group, I'd say, of all contemporary popular music.
Ringo Starr once said, "I'd like to end up sort of unforgettable." Clearly, Ringo's wish came true. The Beatles were a spectacular, revolutionary force in history that will never be forgotten.
Come together.